So we thought, hey, this is a great opportunity for us to talk about something we love and to provide that coverage for fans where they might not get it. So it really went hand in hand. And the chemistry with Pluggo has been incredible. I mean, he's a great friend. And I think that like you hear the back and forth between us. And like I've only known him the past, we've only been talking for, past few months.
Mm.
But to me it feels like we've been friends for years. So I mean, I love doing the show. It's great just getting to talk about independent wrestling, and I have a lot of fun with it.
What's going on, guys? It's your boy, Tom Talk Trash, and stand back for another interview. This time, I'm joined by the one and only Blair from the GRAINMAKER Wrestling Podcast and for exposure on Love Wrestling. So welcome to the show.
Hey Tom, thanks for having me. A big fan, very happy to be here. So I appreciate the chance to chat with you.
I'm really excited to chat with you, my friend, because I'm also a big fan of your work. I'm not going to lie. But if we take this back to the very beginning, before any of your work, where do you first discover wrestling as an overall fan?
So my very first experience with wrestling, and this is going to date me big time, but my very first experience was watching wrestling with my grandparents. And I vividly remember Outlaw Ron Bass and Brutus the Barber Beefcake, and Outlaw Ron Bass was cutting Brutus Beefcake's forehead with his boot spurs. And this was quite the sight for like someone my age to see on, just morning wrestling television. But after that, I was hooked. So that was my very first experience with it.
You talked about morning wrestling television there. Would this be in the equivalent of where like cartoons would be on a Saturday morning sort of thing, that sort of time slot?
Yeah, I remember it was, I think, 10 o'clock Saturday morning. WWF Superstars, that was the big thing. It was either 10 or 11, might have been 11. So yeah, sitting down, me and my sister would watch cartoons, and then I would watch wrestling right afterwards.
So you brought up there watching wrestling and cartoons. Do you think that's why you maybe connected with wrestling at that time? Because at that time it was very sort of flamboyant with the characters, and Hulk Hogan, for lack of a better word, was a cartoon character come to life.
Mm-hmm. Oh, 100%. I think the two went hand in hand, especially as, someone that age. At that time, wrestling and the characters, I mean, these big, larger than life superheroes. So like for a 6, 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old to see that sort of stuff, I think you're instantly drawn to it just because it's almost like they're like superheroes, like you're watching, Hulk Hogan go out there and destroy the villains and overcome all odds. So it was I think that goes hand in hand with the morning cartoons.
Two sort of tangents to go on there. You brought up the fact that it was your grandparents that got you into wrestling. What was your parents' reaction when they discovered that you was a wrestling fan?
They were cool with it because my grandpa used to take my mom to watch wrestling when it was here in Winnipeg. They would go watch AWA. This is back in the 70s, early 80s, I think it was. And so my parents were cool with it. Later on in life, when I kept watching wrestling, they would watch with me because I think they got a kick out of it. And even up until like my mom would watch more than my dad because I think she had the history of watching it with my grandpa, and she wasn't a huge fan or anything. She would never go out of her way to watch it, but if I was watching, she would sit down and watch it. And unfortunately, my mom passed away this past fall. She had a 4-year battle with cancer, and it happened. But even up till the very end, like when I was with her, if I was there on a Wednesday night, we would be watching Dynamite together. She had her favorites that she liked watching. And even it always struck me as something that like just her interest, because at the time, I mean, she's dealing with her health problems, and or, about a year before she passed, that's when John Moxley had to go into, he had to ask for help with his problems. I think it's documented. It's not my story to tell, but he had to do that. He had to step away. And I remember mentioning that to my mom. And even like a few weeks afterwards, my mom is dealing with all of her issues. She'd still be like, how's John Moxley doing? Is he coming back soon? And I was like, I don't know, Mom, like he's dealing with his stuff. So it's kind of, I always like, that was the kind of person she was who would still ask about stuff like that, so it's
Mm.
just something I want to share.
Oh, that's really cool to hear. You brought up there the fact that you're obviously still a wrestling fan since your mum has passed away and stuff. I'm very
Mhm.
curious to know, do you sort of use wrestling as a connection with your mum now, do you think?
Um, it definitely was, especially before like her last few months, last year or so of her life, because I mean, she was stuck. She couldn't leave the house due to COVID. So, when I would
Mm.
go visit her, I mean, I would show her stuff and, talk about stuff. And even one of the things she said was, before she passed, she was like, if there's anything you want to know, now's the time to ask, just like, questions or whatever. And I remember asking because she had mentioned, I asked a lot of stuff, but I'll mention this one because it's wrestling related. I remember asking about when she would go to shows, and she told me, like, oh yeah, it was, larger than life, and she spent more time watching the crowd and everything than she did the actual wrestling. But the one thing that stuck out to me was when she mentioned going to the corner store and seeing, like Nick Bockwinkel walking down the street, and
Mm.
like, because at that time, that was massive. So there was definitely the that sort of like connection there. So I very much appreciated that. And even she spent most of her time working at Safeway, which is a grocery store, as a meat wrapper. And I
Mm.
remember when I was younger, this is like I was probably 12 or so. One of her coworkers was a wrestler, and she introduced me to him, and he just wrestled local stuff. And then afterwards, I had asked, like, this past year, I said, "Okay, do you remember that guy? I think his name was Rick Patterson. I think that's what it was. No, not it wasn't Rick Patterson. It was Mike Stone."
Mm.
I asked about him, and she mentioned, his name. I went and I looked him up, and the career he had, like, he wrestled local stuff in Winnipeg, but then he also wrestled down in Mexico. He teamed up with Leatherface, who wrestled in
Mm.
FMW. So I reached out to Leatherface and I asked him, "Hey, I asked about this guy," and Leatherface was telling me stories about how they would wrestle in Kansas one night in front of 30 people, and then wrestled in Mexico 2 nights later in front of 10,000. Like, so it's kind of the way it kind of weaves everything together with me and my mom, and then wrestling. It's a nice little thing.
Mm. That's very cool. I am curious to know, you talked about your mum was with you with your wrestling fandom through thick and thin. What
Mhm.
about when the product got more adult and you was a bit of a teenager with like the Attitude Era? What was her reaction to that? What was
Uh,
maybe dad's reaction to
my parents had no problem like calling it as it was. Like, if something was garbage, they would say so, and usually they'd go do something else or whatever. They'd step out of the room, but they never stopped me from watching it. They were
that?
always very supportive with it. And my dad, I mean, he's someone who, he was into Stone Cold Steve Austin, crushing the beers and everything, but same sort of thing. If there was something stupid on TV, like the Katie Vick stuff or whatever, like, they were just like, nah, not for us. So
Mm. I understand what you're saying there. As we sort of move on, oh, actually, before we do that, you talked about the Attitude Era a lot.
mhm.
What was your consumption of WCW at the time? Was you strictly a WWF kid, or was you someone that would flip the channels?
WCW for me was relegated to wrestling magazines, Pro Wrestling Illustrated, stuff like that. And every once in a while on cable, they would give us a few extra channels as a little preview, and one of them was TBS. And it always sort of coincided with a Clash of the Champions or something like that. So I remember watching those, early '90s Clash of the Champions, WCW Saturday Night, which I loved because it was like a 2 hour block of wrestling, and you're seeing all these different wrestlers. So that was sort of my introduction to it. But because we didn't have it full time, I would just get bits and pieces of it. As soon as the Attitude Era kind of kicked in, I noticed that the one sports channel here, TSN, they started carrying WCW, but they would show it on Tuesdays.
Mm.
So I would get to watch Raw on Mondays, and then I'd watch Nitro on Tuesdays. And I mean, I loved Monday Night Raw. I was a big time WWF guy, but I still watched WCW. I took in as much as I could. But now I love the opportunity of going back and rewatching stuff that I didn't get to experience firsthand, seeing
Mm.
some of those cruiserweight matches, because that is very much my jam. I love the flippy wrestling. So seeing, Ultimo Dragon and Psychosis and Rey Mysterio, Eddie Guerrero, and all these characters just out there having these incredible matches. I mean, it's a bit of a treat for all of us to have that luxury of going back to watch.
Mm. You brought up there going back to watch stuff,
Mhm,
like WCW, etc., stuff you missed out on. What
mhm.
you brought up there, the cruiserweights being something that you loved and that you're like, oh, I wish I was a fan during this point. What is something from WCW, or maybe even a gap in your WWF or WWE knowledge that you're like, okay, I'm glad I wasn't a fan. Like, I'm glad I wasn't watching this.
Oh, you know what? You go back and you watch some of the gimmick stuff that WCW had and even WWF had, and it's pretty wretched the lengths that they went to, and even I think one of the things that I find shameful of going back when I see stuff is like just how they treated women wrestlers and even the divas and all of that. Like they really like you know you watch the like, oh, okay, yeah, you're a wrestler and okay, you're gonna have a gravy bowl match or some garbage like that, and it's like these are supposed to be wrestlers, these are people, and like, to me it's almost like, what are you doing here, like, so
Mm,
it's like when I'm a fan of wrestling and I have to like talk about, like, I go back and see that, and if someone's watching with me like trying to explain that, it's like that's what makes me like ashamed to be a wrestling fan, is the
cringe.
way that they were treating them. It's very cringe.
Mm,
But I mean, the with something that I missed, I mean, there was some of that WCW stuff, like the early, or not early, but the 96, right before they really got into their own,
mm.
with the outsiders coming in. I feel like their product was really something that I could sink my teeth into and go back and rewatch and be happy with. I just don't have the time.
I understand that completely. You talk
Mhm,
about there not having the time to live WCW. Where is your current fandom to this day? Like, what is the, maybe you said you don't have the time, but what is the show that you're like, ah, every week, no matter what's going on in life, I will try and catch this.
I think my one go-to is Dynamite. That's the one I will always go out of my way to watch. Like Wednesday nights, that's what I'm watching. And then I'll pick and choose what I watch during the week. Like if I have time, I'll watch, some New Japan or a lot of independent stuff I love watching. But it all depends, like, I've got a life outside of, content creating and doing the podcast and stuff. And unfortunately, I can't do it wrestling all the time as much as I would love to. But Dynamite always, and then, some New Japan, lots of independence. And I pick and choose a lot of the older stuff if I'm, feeling like going back to watch something, if I'm have to research something, or if I'm just like, you know what, this was a good match, I want to go back and check that out.
Mm. You brought up there independent wrestling, which is a beautiful segue to your
Mhm,
podcast with Pluggo for exposure on Love Wrestling. So,
mhm.
how do you connect with the Love Wrestling crew? How do you and Pluggo start doing a podcast? All of that good stuff.
Okay, so I'd been doing the podcast for a few years, and I had known Spencer from Love Wrestling, through Twitter. He had been a guest on the podcast a few times, and then this past January, he reached out to me about joining up with Love Wrestling and doing some streaming, and I was over the moon at that. Like, I cannot say enough great things about Love Wrestling and the crew there. They have made me feel like I've been a part of them since the beginning. So, I mean, I started doing some stream and started doing the brunch gimmick. And then Pluggo and JPJ from Between Two Beards reached out to me and said, hey, why don't you be a guest on Between Two Beards? And, the chemistry was right there instantly with those guys. And shortly after, JPJ reached out to me and he said, him and Pluggo both said, like, hey, that was, a lot of fun. Have you thought about doing, some streaming on your own? Like, there's the opportunity if you have an idea to do a show. And we were kind of like racking our brains of what I could really do, because I mean, you already had AEW shows, you had, you know, you had coverage for a lot of the main shows. I'm like, okay, well, maybe a review show is out of the question. But then Pluggo suggested, hey, why don't we do a show covering independent wrestling? We don't have that right now. We both love independent wrestling. It could be a great thing, because I think this past WrestleMania, there was a lot like the GCW weekend, there's shows constantly, and there wasn't the coverage for that. So we thought, hey, this is a great opportunity for us to talk about something we love and to provide that coverage for fans where they might not get it. So it really went hand in hand, and the chemistry with Pluggo has been incredible. I mean, he's a great friend, and I think that like you hear the back and forth between us, and like I've only known him the past, we've only been talking for past few months,
Mm.
but to me it feels like we've been friends for years. So I mean, I love doing the show. It's great just getting to talk about independent wrestling, and I have a lot of fun with it.
You brought up the chemistry with Pluggo for exposure. How do you, because obviously Pluggo has another great show on Love Wrestling,
Yes.
Between Two Beards with JPJ. How do you try and make your chemistry with Pluggo different? And then also, what has both JPJ and Pluggo taught you about podcasting?
I try not to worry about what they're doing because that's their program. And I mean, for them, they're going to have their chemistry. They're going to have the way they do things, and it works for them. And I fully support it. So I try not to think too much about what they do. I just try to be myself when we're chatting. Like I don't try to be anything I'm not. I'm the same outgoing person I am as I do the podcast. I just love to talk wrestling. So for me, to be able to do that with someone like Pluggo, who also loves wrestling, very friendly, very outgoing, I feel like our chemistry is really something special, and it just continues to build the more we have the more we interact, the more we do the content creating, and I love being able to do it. One of the things that I think that I've really learned from them is just having fun with everything, because that's what wrestling is supposed to be. Not
Mm,
getting too down about stuff, not getting taking it too serious. Just have fun. It's wrestling. Let's enjoy it.
mm. I understand what you're saying completely
Mhm.
there. You talk about having fun there. What do you do to keep yourself sort of in the mindset of this is supposed to be fun and I don't need to focus too much on the aspects of the behind the scenes content creation, like if stuff isn't going well and stuff like that? How do you keep yourself motivated and as a wrestling fan?
It can be tough sometimes because I know like I've put episodes out where like I expected bigger response, bigger reaction about it, and I didn't get that. So it can be a little disheartening. And I've reached out to people before and being like, I was expecting more from this, like really getting down in the dumps. There's been times where I thought of just wrapping it all up, deleting everything, and just not existing again. But
Mm.
then like after I mentioned that, like the guy I talked to is a promoter nearby, and I mentioned that, and he's like, dude, wrestling is supposed to be fun. Like he's been in the same boat where like he brings in a wrestler and all the stress around that, and he's thought about giving up. But like, there's more to it than just the dollars and cents to it. If you love it, then enjoy it. Don't make it so serious. Don't take it so serious. Have fun with it. And that's the way I've tried to go about doing things, because it can be tough. You can get in your own head about stuff. You can worry, and it can really bring you down. And then you just don't like doing it. So I've really tried to really focus on just enjoying what I'm doing, having fun. And if you need to, like, take a step back, get, I don't want to say get fresh air, but like just, unplug from wrestling for a little bit just to re-enjoy it again, then you have to do that.
Mm. So you brought up there, obviously you have your own podcast,
Yeah.
Grainmaker Wrestling. How did that come about, and how do you try and make that different from the for the exposure?
My podcast started, it was fall, winter of 2020, early 2021. Me and my fiance were going for a walk, and like I was bored. We're in the pandemic, you can't do anything. So I needed something to do. And I was kind of like spitballing ideas. I loved wrestling. That's what I was watching so much of it because you couldn't do anything. And then I thought, hey, I should do a podcast. There's not tons of podcasts here, so why not? Could talk a little bit about local Winnipeg stuff, but then also like if I want to talk about AEW or New Japan, WWF, I can still do that. So I came up with the Grainmaker Wrestling Podcast. It's a play on words of living in the prairies where there's lots of grain, and one of my favorite wrestlers, the
Ah,
Rainmaker. So the Grainmaker, that's how I came up with it. And so I started doing the podcast, and I was only going to do every fourth episode it was going to be local stuff, you know. But then after my first interview, I had so much fun doing that, like, because it's not fun doing a podcast where you're talking about yourself. So I did that first episode, and it was great. So then, you know, kept doing some more, and then later on it was like, okay, I'm going to have another guest on, and I just kept loving being able to talk wrestling with someone, having them share their stories and just telling where their fandom came from, you know, getting into wrestling and like all of that, like introducing them to the fans. Because as Canadians, it's something I know I've mentioned on my podcast. We don't really pump our own tires. We don't promote like the successes we've had. So like
Mm.
we should, like, let's document this stuff. Let's tell people like, hey, you're an incredible wrestler. You know, let's put this out there so people can go back and look and hear about it. So that was how like it all came to be, where like now almost every episode is an interview. I just love talking wrestling with people, so it's been great so far.
Mm. You talked about their interviewing and things like that. So how do you go about prepping for the podcast, whether it be reaching out to a guest, whether it be your research, things like that?
You know, I'll look at on social medias and stuff, try to find people who I feel like, you know, I would have not good chemistry, but like people that I would want to promote on the Grainmaker Wrestling podcast. Because in wrestling, there's some incredible people. There's also some really crappy people. So I don't like, I always try to promote positivity, and that's the sort of mindset I go with. So I'll go on to, you know, Twitter, and if I see a clip of something, or, you know, someone recommends a match, you know, I'll go follow that wrestler, and then I'll reach out to them, you know, like tell them what I do, that I would love to have them on the podcast and just to share their story. And for the most part, everyone's receptive. Some people, you know, they don't want to, totally fine. Other people, you know, stand you up. It's part of life. It happens. But for the most part, everyone's super receptive. And it's been great. I take every interview seriously. Even though I'll do the research, I'll go back and I'll look up as much information as the person I can. Some wrestlers, there's nothing out there. So for me, it's a blank slate of learning things. And I love that to do look online from people who might know them. Take a sip of water real quick. Who might
Mm.
know them, and if they share stories or little tidbits, you know, then I run with that as well. So that's my main sort of avenues of research when it comes to guests and preparing.
What about you talked about reaching out to them? Have you
Mhm.
ever sort of reached out to someone and then been like, what do you do when someone's like, I will, but not right now? How do you sort of cope with, I need a guest? How do you make sure you've got enough content in the can, but also make sure it's topical at the same time?
So what I've started doing, because I was doing it week to week, and the stress of that of trying to find a guest, it made it not fun. So now what I do is like for August, I have almost all my episodes recorded. The two that I don't have, it's one I'm recording with Pluggo. We're just reviewing a pay-per-view, and one with a good friend of mine who we're just going to talk about all in and all out. So I have to wait for that. But what I've gotten in the habit of doing is like beginning of the month, I start to think, who do I want on for next month? You know, so I'll make a list of 5 or 6 people, and then I'll start reaching out to them. And if someone wants to, you know, okay, I tell them, hey, okay, so I'm recording for September. We record late August, early September. If you're interested, I'd love to have you on. And for the most part, everyone's been down with that. So I've gotten in the habit of recording a full month within the, you know, 2 weeks, the end of the previous month, beginning of that month, just so I have 4 or 5 episodes that I can release schedually and not have to worry about like, who am I going to talk to? What am I going to do? And it's been like quite the stress relief doing this. It's a
Mm.
busy 2 weeks, but I'm very happy with it.
What do you do? You talked about it being a busy 2 weeks. What do you do, like, if you get overwhelmed when it comes to, I've got to cram all this in within those 2 weeks? Do you sort of, how do you sort of keep yourself from being overwhelmed?
Um, you know what? I try to like, one of the main things is that I remember that wrestling is supposed to be fun. And like, you know, I try to make the most of it. It's There's so much other stresses in life that I've had to deal with that like when it comes to this, like, okay, it's supposed to be a time where I can step away and, you know, talk wrestling with someone. So try not to get too in my head about it, and I try not to worry too much. And it's tough because, like you're thinking like, okay, I got to prepare. So like I'll set aside time where like I'm doing my research. I'll usually do it on lunch breaks at work because like if I'm going to be on my phone, I might as well make it, what's
Productive.
the word? Productive. Yeah. So I'll do my research while I'm on my phone, so I can go through, okay, there you go. So that eliminates, having to do that when I get home. So that's like one thing that like has really worked out well for me is like utilizing that time where, instead of just being on Twitter or Instagram, hey, I'm going to do research. One less thing I have to worry about.
Hmm. So you brought up that I'm going to get you to put something out into the universe, actually.
Okay.
Who is your bucket list for the podcast? Who is your bucket list for exposure? If you and Pluggo have co-hosts or start interviews, who's your bucket list for Grainmaker? Things like that.
Okay. So for Grainmaker, I'll start off with that one. I have two very big ones. I would love the opportunity to chat with Rosemary from Impact because Rosemary she grew up in Winnipeg, just outside of Winnipeg. She spent, part of her formative years here. So the opportunity to talk to her, definitely. And also Kenny Omega, which I mean, kind of seems like a very like everyone, of course, would want to talk to Kenny Omega, but because he had such a huge impact in Winnipeg, wrestling on the independents here. And I mean, there is a Kenny Omega AJ Styles match that the promoter has. It happened in Winnipeg back in the early 2000s that, like to be able to talk stories about that, the people he was wrestling at that time, I think it would be a very fun interview. And we wouldn't even have to talk about, his New Japan or AEW stuff. There's enough like independent wrestling that he was a part of that you could talk for hours about it. So those are two for the podcast. Um, I'll throw two more podcast related things just on the off chance they hear, and then I ever run into them. The chance to take a selfie with Elliot Tyler, where we're all looking down at the camera that he's become known for, and also to appear on an episode of the Rads Tales from the Undercard. Would love the opportunity for that. Don't know if it'll happen, but who knows? When it comes to for exposure with Pluggo, ooh, right now I would love the chance to have Jordan Oliver on, the chance to talk to him, because in my mind the matches he's had on the independents, there is no reason that he shouldn't be considered for wrestler of the year, because it seems each and every week he's going out there and he's putting on a 5-star match, whether it's singles, tag team with Nick Wayne. The guy is absolutely on fire. He was definitely someone I would love to have on the show.
I understand what you're saying completely there. And I understand, like, with your podcasting and things like that, obviously you built up a great thing of content for yourself.
Mhm.
If this was to all end tomorrow, would you be happy with what you've accomplished? Things like that. And what would you want your overall legacy in podcasting to be?
I would be, you know what, if I for some reason had to stop tomorrow, like couldn't do another podcast, I would be happy with what I've been able to do. It's led me to do commentary for a promotion, that's up on YouTube. It's led me meet some incredible wrestlers, to like sit down and eat lunch at the same table as Tom Lawler, which is something I never imagined. I've been able to meet so many incredible people, wrestlers, just from doing this podcast. I've made so like friends by doing this podcast. So I would be very happy with what I've been able to do. And I mean, I don't think I would have any doubts or anything like that. I mean, I did something that a lot of people always talk about doing, but never put pen to paper. I went out and I did a podcast. People always say like, "Oh, I want to start one. I want to talk about this." How many people do it? So I was able to do that. And if I was to be remembered for anything, it's just to be a positive in independent wrestling, to know that I helped someone, whether it's, maybe bring more exposure to them. Maybe I can help get a booking for them or something, that a promoter might listen to the podcast, reach out to that person. If I'm was able to impact it positively in any way, then I think that's a pretty big win.
That's very cool to hear. As we look at wrapping this up, Blair, we are going to do a segment that I call generic questions. Those of you that have seen my interviews before will know this is where I ask my guests their favorite match, favorite pay-per-view, such as Double or Nothing 2019, favorite wrestler's theme song, favorite wrestler's entrance theme, should I say,
Mhm.
favorite tag team, and favorite wrestler. basically questions that Blair might be asked on social media. So now he'll have a place to be like, guys, I have answered these questions. Please go watch this. So what's your favorite overall match of all time?
Okay, so I have two favorite matches, and they are two very completely different matches. The first one is from PWG Battle of LA. It's the Young Bucks and Adam Cole versus Ricochet, Will Ospreay, and Matt Sydal. It was my introduction to PWG. It got me hooked, and I absolutely love it. It's something that I always tell people, like, if they're looking for a match recommendation, they've never watched PWG, that's the one I give them. It's been able to introduce me to so many new wrestlers. That match, I love flippy wrestling, so to me that match is just perfect. That one, and on the complete opposite spectrum, John Cena and Brock Lesnar from SummerSlam.
Okay.
Watching Cena take, a half dozen suplexes within the first few minutes, the story they were telling, because at the time I wasn't expecting Cena to be tossed around like a rag doll. So that is one of my other favorites. I love that match for completely different reasons.
Sorry about that. My brother just decided to chuck something in my room. I do apologize. That's okay. What about your favorite overall pay-per-view?
Favorite overall pay-per-view? I'm going to go back to 1997, and I will say In Your House Canadian Stampede, the main event of the Hart Foundation versus Legion of Doom, Steve Austin, Goldust, and Ken Shamrock. There's something about that event, the fact that it was in Calgary during Stampede, the Hart Foundation, the fans were so rabid for them. I love that match. I love that pay-per-view. It's nothing like a blow away, 5-star matches or anything like that, but to me, it's one that I can set aside 2 hours, go back, and enjoy it every single time.
Is that the pay-per-view that if I said to you, I have the ability for you to time travel and you can be in the audience for that show? Is that the one that you're like, yeah, I'd love to be in the audience for that show?
Oh, 100%. I would. It's something that I've asked when I've had people from Calgary on. I was like, did you go to In Your House Canadian Stampede? Were you there? Let's talk about that. No one's been there yet. So one day.
That's very cool. What about your favorite wrestler's entrance music?
Ooh, this is a tough one. Okay, I'm going to continue on with the continuation of the Hart Foundation, and I'm going to say the Rocket Owen Hart, because the way his theme kicked off, where it was like, I love that. It's something that I listen to regularly still. So that's the one I'm going to say, the Rocket Owen Hart.
That's very, very cool. What about your favorite overall tag team? I think I have an idea, but I could be wrong.
Favorite overall tag team is the Young Bucks.
Oh, I was wrong. Yeah, I was wrong.
They were so instrumental in me. My dog's whining. Sorry. It's so instrumental in me, like with wrestling and just like my fandom again, that I have all the time in the world for them. I love their matches. I love what they do. I am a huge, huge Young Bucks fan. So they are my favorite tag team.
Heel or face Young Bucks?
I will take either, because even as heels, I think they're great.
Fair enough. And then as we wrap this up, Blair, who's your favorite overall wrestler?
Favorite overall wrestler? That one's tougher. You know what? I think I would have to say, I'm going to go with Bryan Danielson. I think that overall, even if I'm not really feeling one of his feuds or the build hasn't been great, as soon as he steps into the ring, he has me hooked for whatever it is, whether it's a 20-minute, technical masterpiece, whether it's a bloodbath, anything like that. So Bryan Danielson.
Most people know this that know my channel, but he is my favorite as well. And nice. I will fully agree with you in all of that. But as we wrap this up there, the question I end all my interviews on, I believe as content creators, podcasters, whatever word you want to use, with social media in general, we're all sort of going to live forever in some sort of very, very strange way, if you think about the world. So what is one piece of content you're like, I would love to be remembered for that? And then what is one that you're like, yuck, please forget about?
I've had some really great guests on the podcast. some episodes that I'm very, very proud of. I think that there's definitely a couple episodes on there that I hope people they look back at that and be like, okay, that was really something great. The guest was great. The overall vibe was great. Um, and then even just a chance to cement that wrestlers in history, like for what they've been able to do. And definitely one of them was with Michael Richard Blaze from he's out in Alberta. He's done some incredible things, wrestled for 8 hours straight to raise money for Stollery Kids Hospital in Alberta. So I mean, having the chance to talk to him, share his story about something very, very special, I'm very proud of that, and I'm glad that's going to live forever. As for something that like a sort of yuck memory, some of those early podcasts that I did, I mean, because I had all my questions written down, I would just read it verbatim, like no flow, no wiggle room. So for me doing that, like I realize I'm much more of a point form, be able to like, not have it written down in front of me and kind of just use my imagination, use my words a little bit more. So I mean, definitely some of those early episodes, I mean, I think I sounded very very robotic, where it's like, where did you get your start in wrestling, and like, how did it feel to win a championship? And then you realize that the championships don't really mean much to some of those guys.
I understand what you mean. But as we wrap this up, Blair, obviously I want to say thank you for a great conversation. It was a pleasure chatting with you. Where can the good people find you, your work, etc.? Promote yourself.
First off, thank you for having me. I was very stoked to be asked to come on. So thank you so much for that. You can find me up on all social media, Grainmaker Wrestling Podcast, and every Saturday on Love Wrestling, doing For Exposure with my good friend Pluggo, as we take a look at the world of independent wrestling. So definitely check it out on one of those two avenues.
It's well worth doing, guys. As I feel like I say a lot recently, one of probably my favorite podcasters out there, but one of the nicest as well. So if you guys like this video, make sure you like, share, and subscribe to Tom Talk Trash on YouTube. Follow me on Twitter. I'm still not calling it X, at Tom Talk Trash, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye now.